In this lecture, we're going to perform a query for a list of buttons in the document. Querying is the process of selecting elements based on a set of rules. Our menus may have one or multiple buttons. For this reason, I think lists are appropriate. Unlike arrays, lists can have items added or removed. Since a menu can have a variety of elements, we're better off with a list. Otherwise, arrays may give us trouble when trying to add or remove buttons. Let's create the list from the UI controller component. Technically, we could define the list from each state. However, since all states will have buttons, we can store the buttons from the component. At the top of the class, define a public variable called buttons. Our variable is public to allow other classes to access the variable. The type for this variable will be the following: list button. The button class is the class assigned to elements created with the button element. After adding this line of code, an error gets thrown. We forgot to add the namespace. I want to show you a nifty trick for quickly adding a namespace. If we were to select the list class, a light bulb icon would appear to the left of this line of code. Clicking on it reveals various solutions for fixing this problem. One solution is to add the namespace. Let's select this option. After selecting the option, the namespace has been added to the file. If you don't want to scroll to the top of the file to add a namespace, this option can be a powerful shortcut. The variable is ready. We can start updating it with the buttons. Open the main menu state. At the top of the file, add the Unity Engine.UI Elements namespace. Adding this namespace exposes Unity's classes for interacting with the elements. Upon entering the state, we should update the list with the buttons. Set the controller.buttons variable to the following value: controller.root.query. I'm introducing a new method called query. All elements have this method. It's not exclusive to visual elements. The query method searches for elements from within the current element. In this case, we're performing a query on the root element. There are a few pieces of information that we should provide. First, we must specify the type of element we'd like to grab. As we learned, the button class is assigned to button elements. We can pass in the type as a generic. Add a generic within the button class. The query method has parameters. The first parameter is the name of the element. Names must be unique for each element. Having elements with the same name can make it harder to select. Unity recommends treating names as unique IDs. If we want to select a specific element by its name, we can specify that as the first parameter. In our case, we're trying to grab multiple elements. Pass in null. A null value instructs the query not to select an element by its name. Rather than using a name, we can select an element by its class. Classes can be applied to multiple elements. We created a class for applying styles to buttons. Let's pass in the name of the class as a string. The name of the class was called MenuButton. The dot can be omitted. Unity will add it on your behalf. This query should select all elements with the MenuButton class. Despite adding the query, we'll be given an error by our editors. If we hover our mouse over this method, the reason becomes clear. The query method returns a value with a type called uQueryBuilder. Our buttons variable doesn't accept this type. It wants a list of items that have the button type. Luckily, the uQueryBuilder class has a method for converting the results to a list. Chain a method called toList. After chaining this method, the error goes away. As you would suspect, the toList method returns a valid value that can be assigned to the buttons variable. Let's verify the results by counting them. At the top of the file, add the Unity Engine namespace. Adding this namespace will allow us to use the debug class to log values into the console. Back in the enter_state method, call the debug.log method with the controller.buttons.count variables. All lists will store the number of items in a variable called count. If we did everything right, this variable should store a value of 1. We only have one button in our document. Head over to Unity. Try playing the game. If we look in the console, the number of items gets logged. Perfect! We've successfully grabbed the buttons from our document. We can start listening for key presses to move to the next scene. Before moving on, I'm going to go back to Visual Studio Code. We don't need to keep logging the count variable. I'm going to remove this statement. In the next lecture, let's start defining a method for handling key presses.